September 1967. America was changing fast. Muscle cars were getting bigger, more expensive, and more complicated. And across the Atlantic, Ferrari was building machines that represented everything an exotic sports car was supposed to be. Beautiful, expensive, sophisticated, and brutally fast. The Vietnam War was dividing the country. The Summer of Love had just happened. Rock and roll was getting louder, and young Americans were looking for something that represented their generation. Something raw, something honest, something that didn't care about the old rules. Then Plymouth did something almost ridiculous. It took a stripped-down American family car, gave it a cartoon bird on the trunk, removed most of the luxuries, and stuffed one of the most intimidating V8s Chrysler had ever built under the hood. The engine was the 426 Hemi. And in 1968, that combination created something that made very expensive European machinery look vulnerable in the one place that mattered to American muscle car buyers: the drag strip. But what almost nobody remembers is just how absurd the formula really was. This wasn't a hand-built exotic. It wasn't wearing a Ferrari badge. It wasn't even supposed to be luxurious. It was a cheap Plymouth with a bench seat, basic interior, and a massive American V8 capable of turning pavement into smoke. And for a brief moment, the new Road Runner could deliver acceleration that belonged in a completely different price class. Most people know the 426 Hemi, but you probably don't know the full story of how it ended up inside the cheapest performance Plymouth Chrysler could build. And that's where things get interesting. By the late 1960s, Plymouth had a problem. The company already had the GTX. It had big engines, it had performance, but the GTX was becoming too expensive for the young buyers Plymouth desperately wanted. The average age of performance car buyers was dropping. These weren't established businessmen anymore. They were young guys, many just out of high school or college, working regular jobs, and they wanted speed without the country club price tag. So Chrysler went in the opposite direction. Forget luxury, forget chrome, forget expensive options. Build something light, simple, and fast. The result was the 1968 Plymouth Road Runner. Its starting price was around $2,870 for the basic coupe, depending on configuration, and the philosophy was brutally simple: put the money into the parts that made the car go and leave almost everything else behind. The standard engine was a specially prepared 383, rated at 335 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque. But Plymouth offered one upgrade that completely changed the personality of the car. For roughly $714 more, you could order the 426 Street Hemi. And suddenly, this inexpensive Plymouth had an engine originally born from Chrysler's obsession with winning races. That was the moment the story changed. Because the 426 Hemi wasn't just another big block. It was Chrysler's answer to the brutal competition of NASCAR and drag racing. The Hemi had proven itself on superspeedways and drag strips across America. It had embarrassed Ford, it had made Chevrolet nervous, and it had given Chrysler a reputation that money couldn't buy: dominance. Now that same engine was available in a car your neighbor could afford. Its 426 cubic inches came from a 4.25-inch bore and 3.75-inch stroke. Compression was 10.251. The engine used forged aluminum pistons, forged steel connecting rods, and a forged steel crankshaft supported by 5 main bearings. The center 3 main caps were cross-bolted for additional strength. And then there were those heads. The name Hemi came from the hemispherical combustion chambers. Instead of putting the valves in a conventional arrangement, Chrysler positioned the intake and exhaust valves on opposite sides of the combustion chamber. That allowed larger valves and a more direct path for air to enter and exhaust gases to leave. Think of it like opening a highway instead of forcing traffic through a narrow city street. The 426 used enormous 2.25-inch intake valves and roughly 1.90-inch exhaust valves. These weren't small compromises. These were massive valves that could move serious air. And air is what makes power. Then Chrysler placed 2 4-barrel Carter carburetors on top. 2. each one capable of supplying an enormous amount of air and fuel. The sight of dual quads sitting on top of that enormous air cleaner became one of the most intimidating engine bay visuals of the muscle car era. Officially, Plymouth rated the engine at 425 horsepower at 5,000 RPM and 490 pound-feet of torque at 4,000 RPM. But those numbers didn't tell the whole story. The Hemi had a reputation for being conservatively rated. Some people believe the real output was significantly higher. Chrysler had reasons to underrate the engine: insurance classifications, NASCAR homologation rules, and the simple fact that the numbers were already intimidating enough. And in a relatively stripped-down Road Runner, all that torque didn't have to move a luxury car. It had one job: move the car, fast. But there was a problem. How do you take nearly 500 pound-feet of torque and send it through a car originally designed around affordability? Plymouth knew exactly what could happen: twisted axles, broken drive shafts, shattered transmissions. So the Hemi Road Runner received heavy-duty hardware. A 4-speed Hemi car used the stronger Dana 60 rear axle with sure grip and available 3.54 or 4.10 gearing. The transmission was the heavy-duty A833 4-speed. An automatic A727 torque flight was also available. The Dana 60 wasn't some lightweight passenger car axle. This was serious hardware, designed to handle serious abuse. The A833 4-speed was equally robust, with a reputation for surviving punishment that would have destroyed lesser transmissions. This wasn't over-engineering for decoration. It was survival. Because when that Hemi came on the cam and both carburetors started feeding those huge cylinders, the drivetrain had to deal with a wall of torque. And then the Road Runner reached the drag strip. This is where the Ferrari comparison becomes fascinating. Ferrari's cars were built around a completely different philosophy. They were lighter, more sophisticated, and designed to combine acceleration with handling, braking, and high-speed road performance. A Ferrari was meant to dance through mountain roads in Italy. It was designed for balanced performance across every driving situation. The engines were mechanical art, the interiors were trimmed in leather, and the entire package represented European motorsport heritage. The Road Runner didn't care about any of that. It was an American sledgehammer. And on the quarter mile, the Hemi had one massive advantage: torque. Period road tests recorded Hemi Road Runners running the quarter mile in the low 13-second range, with trap speeds around 105 miles per hour. One commonly cited figure for the 426 Hemi car is approximately 13.55 seconds at 105 miles per hour. Some magazines recorded even quicker times when conditions were right and the driver knew what they were doing. That's astonishing when you remember what this car actually was: a Plymouth. A cheap one, a car with a bench seat, a car that looked like something your neighbor might drive to work. And under the hood sat an engine with 2 4-barrel carburetors, hemispherical heads, forged internals, and enough torque to make the rear tires beg for mercy. You can probably guess what happened next. The Road Runner became a sensation. Plymouth sold more than 44,000 Road Runners in 1968, including more than 1,000 equipped with the 426 Hemi, according to commonly cited production figures. And that number matters. Because the Hemi Road Runner wasn't just fast. It was rare enough to become something special. Only a small percentage of buyers were willing to pay the extra money for the Hemi. Most people settled for the 383. And honestly, that engine was already enough to make the Road Runner dangerous. But the people who checked the Hemi box were buying something else entirely. They were buying the engine that Chrysler had built to dominate. And now it was sitting inside a Plymouth designed to sell to ordinary Americans. That was the genius of the Road Runner. Plymouth didn't try to beat exotic cars by becoming an exotic car. It beat them by refusing to play the same game. Ferrari could spend enormous amounts of money chasing sophistication. Plymouth could spend its money on displacement, airflow, compression, gearing, and brute force. One was an Italian scalpel. The other was a sledgehammer. And on the drag strip, you didn't need a scalpel. You needed traction. you needed torque, and you needed an engine that could turn rear tires into smoke. Then came one of the most important details of the entire package: weight. The Road Runner wasn't featherlight, but it was stripped down compared with many performance cars. There was no need to fill the cabin with luxury equipment. There was no elaborate center console. The car was intentionally basic. That meant more of the Hemi's power could go toward acceleration instead of dragging unnecessary weight down the quarter mile. And when you combine roughly 425 gross horsepower with 490 pound-feet of torque, a relatively simple drivetrain, aggressive gearing, and a willing driver, the result is exactly what Chrysler wanted: violent acceleration. The engine didn't need to scream like a small European V12. It could simply shove. You would hear the exhaust. Then the engine note would deepen. The tachometer would climb. The rear tires would fight for grip, and the Road Runner would launch forward. The feeling wasn't refined. It was brutal. The kind of acceleration that pushed you back into the seat and made you understand exactly why people called it a muscle car. For a few seconds, everything else became irrelevant. But here's the part that makes the story even stranger. The Hemi Road Runner wasn't some secret factory race car. You could walk into a Plymouth dealership and order one. That's what made the whole idea so dangerous. The technology came from Chrysler's racing obsession, but the customer experience was completely different. You didn't need a racing license. You didn't need a wealthy family. You didn't need a Ferrari-sized bank account. You needed enough money to check the right box. And that changed the muscle car war. Because suddenly, performance wasn't reserved for expensive sports cars. It was available to almost anyone willing to accept a little noise, a little vibration, and a lot of attitude. The 426 Hemi became the weapon. The Road Runner became the delivery system. And 1968 was the moment the two came together for the first time. That first-year combination became legendary because the Road Runner itself was brand new. Plymouth had taken the affordable muscle car idea and pushed it to its logical extreme. No pretending, no luxury, no apology, just speed, just attitude, just a cartoon bird and an engine that could embarrass cars costing twice as much. And the numbers prove why the Hemi version became so feared. The 426 displaced 425.6 cubic inches, or about 7.0 liters. It produced 425 horsepower officially and 490 pound-feet of torque. Its 10.251 compression ratio, dual Carter 4-barrel carburetors, high-flow heads, forged rotating assembly, and heavy-duty valve train gave it the hardware to make serious power. But there was another reason the Hemi was so respected: strength. The crankshaft was forged. The connecting rods were forged. The pistons were forged. The block was built to survive the punishment. And the 5-main bearing bottom end wasn't treated like a normal grocery getter engine. Chrysler knew exactly what people were going to do with these cars. They were going to race them. They were going to modify them. They were going to launch them over and over again, and they were going to find out where the weak points were. So Chrysler gave the Hemi the hardware to fight back. That's why the engine became more than an option. It became a legend. And that's also why the Ferrari comparison needs to be understood correctly. The Road Runner didn't suddenly become a better automobile than a Ferrari. It didn't magically gain Ferrari's cornering ability. It didn't become a European Grand Tourer. It did something much more specific. It delivered extraordinary straight-line acceleration for the money. And that was enough to embarrass cars that cost dramatically more when the road turned into a quarter mile. Think about how strange that must have looked in 1968. A Ferrari represented exclusivity. The Road Runner represented rebellion. One had an exotic badge. The other had a cartoon bird. One was built with Italian sophistication. The other arrived with a big block V8 and a 4-speed. One cost more than most people's houses. The other could be financed by a guy working at a gas station. And when the lights turned green, the philosophical difference disappeared. There was only acceleration, there was only the sound, and there was only the finish line. The Ferrari driver might have expected respect. What he got was humiliation. But the phrase, "for 1 year only," has to be handled carefully. The 426 Hemi Road Runner wasn't actually limited to 1968. Plymouth continued offering the street Hemi in the Road Runner for 1969 and 1970. In fact, the Hemi remained one of the defining performance options of the early Road Runner era. So why does 1968 matter so much? Because it was the beginning. The first Road Runner. The first year of the nameplate. The first time Plymouth combined this stripped-down philosophy with the 426 Hemi. And the first year proved that the formula worked. Plymouth had created something much bigger than another muscle car. It had created a cultural weapon. The Road Runner became one of the defining cars of the muscle era, and its success showed Chrysler that buyers didn't necessarily want more luxury. They wanted more performance. They wanted honesty. They wanted a car that didn't apologize for what it was. The first-year Road Runner sold tens of thousands of examples, while the Hemi cars remained a tiny and desirable fraction of that total. And for the people who ordered one, the experience was unforgettable. Walking into the dealership and checking that Hemi box meant you understood what you were getting into. Higher insurance, more maintenance, worse fuel economy, and absolutely zero regrets. And then the world began to change. Insurance rates climbed. Emissions regulations tightened. Fuel economy became more important. The muscle car arms race couldn't continue forever. The enormous engines that had seemed unstoppable at the end of the 1960s were about to face an entirely different enemy. Government regulation, fuel prices, and changing consumer priorities. But the 426 Hemi had already done its job. It had proven that a mass-produced American muscle car could deliver performance that seemed impossible for the price. And that's why people still talk about it. Not because it was the fastest car in every situation. It wasn't. Not because it could out-handle a Ferrari. It couldn't. The real story is much more interesting. Plymouth didn't beat Ferrari by becoming Ferrari. It built something Ferrari couldn't easily duplicate. A brutally simple American muscle car with a racing-derived V8, massive torque, aggressive gearing, and a price ordinary buyers could actually dream about. The 426 Hemi was the heart of that experiment, and the 1968 Road Runner was the perfect body for it. A cheap car, a huge engine, and absolutely no interest in playing by the rules. That's what made the combination so dangerous. And maybe that's the real reason the story survived. Because for one unforgettable moment in the muscle car era, you could pull up to a drag strip in a Plymouth that looked almost ordinary, hear that Hemi come alive, and make something wearing a much more prestigious badge look very nervous. The experience of driving one was something people remembered decades later. The sound of those dual carburetors opening, the feeling of all that torque hitting the pavement, the smell of burning rubber, the looks from people who couldn't believe what they just saw. The Ferrari had the name, the Plymouth had the torque. And when the light turned green, the only thing that mattered was what happened next. That moment defined an entire generation of American performance. Not with sophistication, not with elegance, but with raw, unfiltered, unapologetic power. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the wildest American engines ever put into a street car, let me know what forgotten muscle car engine should be next. And subscribe, because the next story may be hiding under a hood that looks completely ordinary, until you find out what's actually inside.